Hi everybody. This video is going to be about transparency and the use of transparency, pardon me, in color to change color. Now I've talked about that before in other videos in the past about the idea of glazing and using thin paint. So this kind of follows on, but maybe makes us focus a wee bit more. A couple of things maybe to keep in mind before we look at the whole thing. It's a slower process, obviously, this, because what we're going to be doing is layering paint. So therefore it is important that the layers of each coat of paint are dry, ideally, before you put another one on. So it's not a spontaneous style of painting at all, and it goes back to the Renaissance days and maybe before, where the paint was built up very, very slowly over much time. So be patient, I think, is what I'm saying. Try not to rush ahead if you're using, particular oils and watercolors. If the watercolors are still damp when you try to put another layer on, you're going to move them, and likewise with the oils. So it is a matter of being prepared to do that. So your activities will take longer, so therefore don't feel, oh, I've got to do something in a week and send it to Sam, let him see what I've done. It might take a little longer, and that's okay. If you're using acrylic, as you know, will dry really quite quickly, so you'll probably find yourself layering the paint fairly quickly. Those of you who use oils, work with the oils. Alternatively, if you have some acrylics and you want to use the technique as acrylic, you could do, because the principle is the same. What I'm trying to get through here is how transparent color changes other colors. So whether it's oils or acrylics may not be absolutely critical, although I know oils is slightly different, of course. So think about that. But have a look now at some of the ideas that I'm going to show you, and hopefully you'll find them of some use.
Okay, folks, a couple of important things maybe just before you start these little exercises. Thinking about the consistency of the paint, because we are talking about layering paint here, transparent layers. So it goes without saying that we don't want the paint overly thick. It makes sense that if the paint is very, very thick, then the object will be covered over, so it has to be see-through. So just a couple of things. This is oil paint here just to start with, but you can see obviously if I have a totally thick layer of paint like that, all paint is transparent. You can see through a little bit, but obviously if I was to put it on something like this page here, with the orange on it, you're not going to see it. It's completely covered, and that it seems very obvious, but it is important to get that right consistency of paint. If you simply dilute the oil paint, if it's oils you're using, with say turpentine, pure terps, the problem with that is that terps dilutes the paint, but it doesn't have as much sticky quality, adhesive. So therefore, if you're painting over the top of previously painted pieces of oil, then it'll skid over it. It won't stick so well, because it doesn't have that glue, as it were, in it. It's not really an oil. It's a spirit of sorts. It's a turpentine. So I don't know if that's possible to sort of demonstrate here, but I'm taking a little bit of turpentine, putting a few drops in to this oil, and you can see it goes quite watery, and it doesn't have a honey feeling, like honey. And therefore, if I put it over, I don't know if this will work or not. This is dry paint. It's dried on the palette. But if I put it over that, you'll see that this marks there, that you can see when I push it with my finger, it feels like water. It's not tacky. When I do that, I don't feel my fingers sticking together. And therefore, while it sometimes looks okay, it won't really stick to the top of that paint for loads and loads of time. Yes, it might stick for maybe even years, but it doesn't have the same quality at all. So you will need to think about when you're glazing, maybe using another medium. Most commonly used is probably linseed oil, just this refined linseed oil that I'm using here. And so this is linseed oil, as I was saying there. Just take a little bit, and maybe if I pour it, hopefully you can see. I mean, most of you will have used linseed oil and all of that, so I'm kind of, preaching to the converted. But you see the way I'm going to pour it out. It sits there because it has that sticky honey, thin honey quality there. You can feel, and when I do that, I can feel a stickiness and oiliness, and that is again why that if I put a little bit of color, tiny little bit of color into that, you can see. Look, you see how it's moving, and you can almost hear the tackiness of it. And obviously it's see-through. It depends on how much oil or how much paint you add and so on. So you can get that nice transparent. Now, I tend to say to people, don't just use absolutely pure linseed on its own. Add a little bit of the turpentine, in. Again, approximately 2 parts of linseed and maybe 1 of turpentine, maybe less than 1, it could be 3 to 1, whatever. But the little bit of turpentine stops it from being shiny when you put it on. If you put pure linseed on as a glaze, it can be very, very polished, very shiny, and a bit frustrating. So, don't overdo it. And also keep in mind that you don't need to apply paint, like this has been made up here. You can see it's a nice gooey varnishy sort of a thing. You don't need to put your paint then onto your subject, your painting, as it were. I have a little painting here left over from some previous study, so I'll turn it around, use the corner of that just to show you. You don't need to lay it on. You see, like this. Look at the big globules of paint. So a lot of people get loads of linseed and then they paint over it. Now you can see through it, okay. That's great, but it's just too heavy and oily. So if I can kind of get rid of that and just show you that if I wipe a considerable amount off that brush and put a little bit on that brush, and that one little bit, you can see I'm putting on, I'm spreading it. That was just one little brush load. And look, you can see it making a difference to the painting. And I haven't even dipped my brush in again. I'm just gently pushing it around. And it works, and it will dry quicker. But some people say, oh, glazing means this, it's like putting a varnish on. No, it's not like that. That's far too severe, really. So be careful of doing that as well. Now, if you want quicker drying times, and obviously if you're going to pursue the idea of glazing, one of the things is that as I said before, you need to wait between layers, and that just requires patience. But if you use linseed oil with your oil paints, and even with a little turpentine, it can take a little while to dry. It certainly would take overnight and probably a day, to be really, really dry, depending how much you put on. But I also use liquid, this Winsor Newton liquid, which is, again, you can see like a gel. I'll try and squeeze a little bit out and let you see. And I actually use it pretty much straight into my paints, to be honest. You can mix it with linseed and terps and all sorts. I've heard people making different mediums up with it, but I just have found that working directly with it is good. And it also gives you the drying time is considerably less. Certainly in a lot of cases, I find that I'm getting drying time overnight, but certainly does speed it up. And you can see here that you can see the consistency here. If I push it up a little bit, it is very much like honey, like syrup, more like a gel. But once you start stirring it around, it it changes, it thins out a wee bit, and it sits nicely on top of colors and things like that. It sits nicely on top of other colors. I'm just going to try and scoop a little bit of brown into it there. Just move that down the camera a little bit so you can see. And you can see the nice sort of, there's a firmness about it, you know. And again, if I get that, if I can find that old painting there, you can see, I'll turn this around here, look. I have a little bit in the brush here. You can see how I kind of like it because because it's got that slight body to it. It flows very nicely. You can see there it flows over the bottom of that section of painting there, and that's again not too much paint, but it gives a nice even glaze. And again, that will dry reasonably quickly. It's as quick a drying as I can think of for oils, if you know what I mean. So that's something you may want to consider investing in, especially if you want to pursue glazing. But it is a nice medium liquid to work with. You can put fairly heavy paint into it as well, and it also dries quicker, so that's another benefit. Now talking about acrylic paints. Acrylic paints are plastic basically, you know, to put it very, you know, based on polymers and things like that, as you may know. So if you're someone who works with acrylics, be aware of that. And the thing with acrylics is they need the medium, the plastic medium that's mixed in it to give them adhesion to stick. It's basically glue, I suppose. And again, if we were using water, which is the medium for acrylic, of course, if we watered acrylic down too much, for instance, like that, and we tried to put it on top of another piece of acrylic paint, it wouldn't really stick, because just like oils, we have overdone the medium. The water breaks down the glue that's in here, so there's so much water that there's not very much glue left, and therefore it doesn't stick to the surface. Whereas obviously if I used a piece of paint, you know, as thick as that, look, you can see the difference. It's gooier, and we've just diluted it. We've just thinned out the glue, so therefore it's not as powerful. That's all it is. Now, acrylics are very, very transparent at the best of times. So what you find is that I have an old scrap of painting here. I'll move this slightly out of the way. Hopefully you can see this. But even if I take this acrylic paint, which in the corner here, which I haven't thinned out, by the way, you can see that it's just straight from the tube. I'm going to dry the brush I've got here and dip a little in. So that's thick, pure paint straight from the tube. And if I take that and rub it in to this piece of paint, you can see how transparent it is. You can see the picture below it coming through. You can see the lines and all the rest. So acrylic doesn't need an awful lot of dilution before you put it on as a glaze. It depends obviously how light or dark, because obviously if I thin this blue out with a wee bit of water, it would be lighter, like watercolor. But then we lose the adhesion, the stickiness. In that case, this is where, and if you're going to be doing this a lot, it is worth maybe investing in a medium, an acrylic medium. This is a matte medium. In other words, it dries flat, you know, like a velvety finish. If I open the thing, the lid, I'll show you. If we move over here, and if I pour a little bit out onto this, hopefully you can see it there. It's like yogurt, you know, sort of, there you go. That sort of creamy consistency. That means that if you use the medium and a little bit of pure paint, that's straight from the tube paint there, put a wee bit of that in the medium, you see how it thins it out, but it's sticky. So that's the glue really that we're losing when we overdo the water. So now we've got a nice transparent glaze, but it's also got that nice sticky varnishy quality to it, and therefore if we put it on, look at that, you get a lovely transparent blue, but yet it's a nice firm painterly feeling. It doesn't feel like watercolors, running and scraping around. So that's maybe something that it's worth maybe investing in that anyway, because it's a useful thing for painting generally. Okay, what I'm going to do here is, this is a little piece of acrylic paint here. What I've done is I've laid out a pile of blocks of like a lime green, a fairly raw sort of a green. And what I'm going to do, using glazes rather than mixing this time, I'm going to adjust the temperature of the green. I'm going to adjust the tone of the green, the dark and light if you like, and I'm going to adjust the saturation of the green down this way. So the green is going to get darker that way, it's going to get cooler that way, and it's going to desaturate that way. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to apply another layer of the same green, which is here in my palette here, on those three. I'm going to keep that as my starting point so we can compare that, okay? So I'm going to put another layer there, there, and there. So those three will have a second layer. Then when they dry, I'm going to put another layer on those two. So they will have 3 layers. And then finally another layer on that. So that will have 4, 3, 2, and so on. So the layers will build up that way. And the same process will be for the temperature. So in this case, being green, the cooler temperature will be going towards blue. So I've got a little blue. These will all be mixed with this medium to make them very transparent. And follow the same procedure with blues that way. So we get coldness. And then in the case of desaturating, I'm adding a complementary. The complementary to yellow green is a slightly purplish red, which you can see that I've got here. And I'm going to add that. So we'll just take one first. We'll move over here with our medium and put a little bit of this green in there. So you'll see that appearing to be lighter, but it's because it's more transparent. So I'll make a big batch of this so that I'm using the same consistency, as it were, in each layer. So I'm going to scoop quite a lot of the medium there. And again, not going to apply it too heavily. So you can see I'm actually scraping quite a lot off. And what I'm going to do then is put another layer onto this and another layer onto that one. So they'll get exactly the same amount, or near as I can do that. Okay, so that's that. Then I'll just move try to move the light a little bit there if it helps. Just take away the glare. Bear with me. That's a wee bit better, I think. Hopefully move that down ever so slightly. So what I'm going to do is let that be for the moment. Rinse out, clean up the brush, and then apply the blues. So I'm going to change the temperature now. Same thing. I'm going to take a little bit of blue, not too much. I'm going to rinse the brush and add a little medium. I'm just using the brush rather than a palette knife here. And again, make enough up that I can reuse it, as it were. So I'm making one batch, a little bit more blue there. Okay, so I'm going to take that varnish, if you like to call it that, and I'm going to put a layer of that on there. A layer on that. Try not to overbrush it. And a layer there, so they're all treated exactly the same that way. Now I rinse the brush and do the same with my purpley red, which is basically crimson, really. You know, I've added a tiny bit of ultramarine to it, but really not much more than that. And again, when you add the medium, the plate shines through and it looks much more pinky, but it's actually just the white of the plate. So again, a fairly generous amount of that, and I am going to scrape some off and work diagonally this time. So a little bit of that over there. Scrape a wee bit more off, actually, a little bit of that there. And a tiny bit at the end there. So again, see through, the green is shining through, as it were. There's no thick paint, there's no white in it, or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is let that dry for a second. then going to come back and do another layer of that. Now this should be dry enough for me to follow the same sort of process. This time I'm just giving this one a second or third layer there, and also the one at the end. So we've got those two just slightly more intensified. Same with the blue end now, the vertical up and down, vertical set here, which I have over here. So this time I'm leaving that one and I'm doing this one. So this is getting a second layer of blue, and this is getting a second layer of blue down there. You can sort of see the edges of the other colors below coming through, which is good too. And then we'll go to our purplish red for the desaturated bit, and we'll only do the two lower ones. Sorry, I have too much paint on that there. Just dilute that a little bit. Sorry, I beg your pardon. That's better. So we're going to layer that. And we're going to layer that one. Just take the last bit off that. So now we have another set of adjustments made with glazing, and we'll come back to that when it's dry. So now we're going to work on the last end pieces, as it were. So here I'm going to work with the green onto this one, another layer of this green onto the end here, and then rinse my brush and follow the same procedure again with the blues. Get that loosened up. It's beginning to dry slightly on the palette, but there we go. And then rinse that, and then we'll take our reddish color here and put that down onto this one. And what you see is a set of progressions, okay? So you can see now very, very subtle progressions from light to dark, from warm to cold, and from saturated to desaturated. I think my complementary was maybe too much on the red side, so it's gone rustier, but it has drained out the color. You know, it's made that much muddier. So in a sense, we've got some sort of effect there. But what's nearly as important is the tiny increments and the very orderly increments from light to dark. You can see very subtle changes. And if I were to say to someone, tell you what, mix me up 4 colors like that and 4 like that, and get them as close in incremental steps, we would all find that very, very, very difficult to do. And this is the beauty of glazing, because I'm putting this, or I'm attempting to put the same batch of color, that's the same transparency, same consistency. I'm not making it thicker or darker or lighter. It's the same each time. Then obviously the increments will be accurate. It'll be the same amount each time that the change will take place, if that makes sense. Whereas when we're mixing it, we might accidentally stir a wee bit of extra in there, a wee bit of white, and it may not be the same. Whereas here, we can control the increments, and that is one of the biggest advantages with glazing. But also, it is a lovely way to create certain color harmonies. Now, I thought I just was going to stop there, but I thought it might be interesting to do one more wee thing, which is obviously what we've done here. We've changed temperature, we've changed tone, light to dark, and we've changed saturation here. And in some regard, we've also changed temperature there too, because I made my reddish complement not as blue as it should have been. In other words, not as purple. It is made warmer, so that green becomes not only desaturated and drained out, but also warmer as well. So we've done that. However, I thought it might be interesting to use the desaturating color. Now I've adjusted it, you can see here, to more of a purple, because I think because we're nearly at a yellow green, purple is the complementary of yellow, so I think I needed to compensate for the amount of yellow in that green. So what I'm going to do is take this thin purpley color and apply it over some of these other things. So if I was to take a little over these things. Might be interesting to watch. How that coolness, the blue that I added to the green, not only now was cooler in temperature, but now becoming grayer, less color, more desaturated. Likewise, I could experiment with what's along the top here. So let's give a layer of that to these, trying to give them about the same amount, which can be difficult, but you know, and again, not maybe to overbrush too much. And if I tilt that, maybe the light's better there, but you can see, look what I've done now. Now what I've done, I've desaturated all of them on all of these, but they've maintained their change. You know what I'm saying? That as we go down here, you can see it getting cooler and deeper. There's a difference still between them. That's deeper, that's cooler, that's a wee bit warmer, that's a wee bit warmer, and so on. Likewise, these still get darker, slightly darker each step, but yet they're desaturated. And I suppose if you know, now that I've made up a more purple color instead of the reddish color, I might just say, well, what happens if I glaze these? So I'm basically harmonizing everything, and everything is getting the same treatment. And that's why you can see that it works in a very strict, nice harmony now. These, you can see getting darker and muddier, but now with a different glaze on top. So in other words, they maintain the changes, but they now a desaturated version of those changes. So the first thing that we want to do here is we're talking about local color, okay? And what I've done, I've decided on this orangey, reddish orange disc, okay? Now it might be it could be an orange, could be an apple, it might end up either, to be honest, but what I'm doing is pretending I'm starting with a base color and saying, okay, let's start with that highly saturated orange disc. And what I'll do now is make adjustments to that and see where we go with it, okay? So what I have in my palette over here is a little yellow and a little orange, the same orange that this is from. Pretty much, actually, it might be slightly deeper, but hopefully it's the same tone, okay? And a little medium, okay, over here. So what I'm going to do is bring the medium over as we did with the little exercises. That appears to be lighter because of the plate shining through. What I'm doing is mixing up this. I'll mix a reasonable amount of this, dilute it with the medium, and you can see that it is transparent here, okay? Sorry, I scooped too much up there. I'll just clean that off. So what I'm going to do is add the same type of color, in other words orange, on top of the orange that I've already got. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some of that, try to be as generous as I can, but I want to keep it thin enough that it is transparent. So on this side of this disc, that may be an orange or whatever, we're going to put half of that in with another layer. And just like in our little samples, what I'm doing, by the way, is I'm cleaning the brush at the minute. So with the dry brush, I'm just softening the edge of that to give it a nice sort of blended effect. But you can see one layer of transparent orange on top of another layer is making a slight difference in the light shade relationship. Now what I'm not going to touch that anymore at the moment. What I'm going to do in the meantime is clean that brush, go in now with the yellow, and again scoop a little medium over there. Hopefully I haven't got orange in that, but there we have a transparent yellow. And it shows you how little paint we need to make these changes. And over here, I'm going to put yellow on top of the base orange. So up around this half, let's call it a quarter, whatever. I'll put that on, and likewise, I'm going to quickly rinse the brush, wipe it pretty much dry, and just while the paint's still a wee bit wet, because it is acrylic paint we're using, but with oils, this might give you a wee bit more time. You could then just soften the edges of that there, look. So now what we have is a nice change of temperature from the orange or reds over towards the yellow end of the spectrum up here, and a nice change of tone from the rich base orange to slightly deeper orange here, all done with paint you can see on my finger here, as thin and see-through as that. Look, see that? So that's the beauty of the subtlety of glazing. Now I'm kind of going to wait for a few seconds till that's completely dry and come back to that. Now I'm going to do the same thing here. This is pretty much dry. So again, same layer of orange, same consistency, same type of orange. So we're not changing anything other than the density, the amount of layers. And this time I'm going to go over, not the halfway, but maybe to the, maybe a third down at the bottom here, let's say. There, and I'm going to stop about here. Then I'm going to clean the brush, wipe it again, and just soften that edge ever so slightly, although it is quite nice and soft anyway. And now I hope you see, just in that corner, a change of tone from that middle to that. So we now have 3 tonal changes, and it's becoming more richer and reddy oranges because the orange is becoming more intense. So the light's not getting through it to make it lighter. So while we're waiting on that to dry, if you like, we'll just take and try one more time with our little bit of the yellow. So again, transparent yellow, and I'm just going to put another layer, pretty much the same density as I did, but again this time it'll just be a fragment of that there, and I'm going to soften that out as well. So this is see-through. The orangey color below is shining through this, but you can see that it's layering that's changing the color, not me adding white or anything else. Now what I thought I might do here is just keep, before I move on to the next phase, if you like, I'm just taking another little piece of transparent orange. You can see on my hand there, you can see it, the thinness of it, okay? And I'm just going to put that onto the very bottom bit here and just try and take it up to the edge if I can. Just in that bottom quarter or less. Okay, and then, you know, you can see, I think, again, it's getting that bit deeper there, okay? So we now have another step. Let that dry, and then we'll talk about saturation and temperature. Now, this bit can be a little bit scary because I'm now going to move to slightly different colors, because up to now it's been yellow and orange, and that makes sense. So I'm able to get layers and layers built up and deeper, but still with the same saturation. It's still rich. So now I want to calm that. The complementary of orange is blue, so I'm going to chance using this ultramarine, but hopefully you can see the amount of medium I'm using here. There's the medium. If you were using oil paints, this would be your linseed or maybe your liquid, or maybe even terps if you've nothing else, but not too much. One you can see is how dilute that is. Look at that see-through. There's very little pigment in that, and that's deliberate. I want to be fairly cagey about this. So I'm putting blue on top of this orange now. So over here, I'm just putting this very washy blue that's barely, you can see it on the palette. It's you would think there's very little blue paint in the mix, which there isn't, or there isn't actually. So just going to do that across that section there, and it's nearly halfway. But and again, maybe just try and soften the edge just to make it look a little better, but that's not the essence of the exercise really. But you can see, and I hope what you can see there is a coolness, that now the readiness of the orange, the oranginess is just beginning to disappear ever so slightly there. And I was very cagey, but what we'll do is let that dry and go in again and just maybe take it a bit further. Now this paint, this blue paint here, is pretty much the same consistency as the layer I just put on to that corner over here. So I'm not making my paint darker to force the issue. What I'm doing is relying on layer over layer over layer to build the darkness, and that's why we're getting these beautiful subtle changes. So if I was to take now and put a little bit of that not quite as far as I did the last time. Say over here, maybe bring it around the edge there, look, there. And again, wipe the brush slightly and just soften that in. You can see already that the bit where I've just been working is that little bit deeper and less saturated. So, you know, we're just doing that as a layer. It's not that I made that darker. It was the same consistency as the previous layer. It's just that that bit has two layers now. This is now dry again. So what I'm going to do, this is the same mixture. I haven't changed it. It's dried a little bit. So I'm going to try and mix another version of it because it's dried on the palette. But there you go, same amount of blue. But what we'll do this time is just get right down into this bottom section and do a tiny little bit along the bottom here, look. Just that bit, leave it at that. And then just soften out the edges again with a pretty much a dry brush. Just tap that so it softens a wee bit. And again, you can see that that appears dark. Well, it is darker down at the bottom there, and that's simply just putting another wee bit on there. That is just because I have put another layer on top of what we already had there. So I'm getting that deeper shadow as a glaze, not as thicker paint. What I thought now, hopefully what you've seen is how we can make these changes to the tone, temperature and saturation within building of layers, and the subtleties that you can get. It's very difficult to do in any other way. But again, just as a bit of fun, and probably I'm going to regret this, but it's all about experiment. And you can see I've got red on my palette there. Hopefully you can see that with quite a lot of medium. And thought, what happens if we just decide to glaze the whole area here, the whole thing? This should be dry, hopefully it is. And if I was to take and say, okay, I'm going to varnish over this whole thing with this red, okay, a little bit more. Okay, so the whole thing is reddened now. But what you will see is I've reddened the overall shape of this, whether it's an orange, an apple, whatever. In one go, I've brought it to a new type of color, or a different type of color, but I've maintained the changes in light, shade, well, not so much light and shade, but temperature and saturation. They will remain there because they can be seen shining through. So, you know, you can glaze for a very long time and still maintain that as long as the glazes are nice and thin and transparent. So what we have now is this sphere beginning to happen, and that's really because of the layering of color, okay? Now, you'll notice that I was adding more of the same orange and building that up, which is obviously going to make that slightly darker each time, which begins to give it its form. Of course, there will come a point where no matter how many more layers I add, I can't really block out any more light. In other words, that orange will stay that way, which is then when we would move, say, to another color, perhaps a deeper color like red, and then round to purple and then down to blue, if we wanted to continue that temperature changes, if you like. But going back to simply the saturation, if I now was to make up the blue, same blue, ultramarine blue, same medium, but slightly denser, slightly more dense. In other words, slightly more paint than before in the previous mixes. Just to let you see that we can then create quite a strong illusion of shadow by adding the blue over the orange. So I'm going to go in here and be a bit bolder than I was earlier. Try and get that right up to the edge there, look, and underneath. And then again, rinse. And you can see immediately that what we get is not blue, dark blue, obviously, because it's a mixture of blue and the orange, reddish orange that was below it. And again, just tapping that with a damp brush just to move the edge a wee bit so it's not a straight edge. And the medium, I think, also allows the the paint to stay wet for a wee bit longer, which is good, which is important, especially with acrylic where, it is a fast drying medium. And you can buy mediums that are deliberately designed for that. They're called retardants, and they slow down the drying time. And again, we can let that dry, come back, and one more time put a little bit more shadow around it. You can see here that I've started thinking about shadows underneath the shape of the orange, and then I thought what I might do is just talk about the shadow that's on the tabletop, because I'm playing around with that surface. You might be able to see. And I thought, well, let's talk about that really, and the same sort of principles apply here. That we have a tabletop that was mixed with blue and a little orange in it, so it's a reverse of what's in this. But if I was to take and say, okay, let me that's resulted in a slightly greenish tone, okay, slightly yellowish green. So again, if I was taking the complementary of green, which is red, but also it's not pure red because it's a cooler red than that. So we maybe make it a purple color, but leaning towards the bluish. And so we're going to cool that color down and create shadow. So in other words, we want this color to shine through because shadows are transparent. You see the color of the object generally a little bit underneath them. So what I've done here, I've mixed up that bluish tone here and quite a lot of medium in it. And what I'm going to do is just put a little bit underneath here. So I kind of pretend I haven't worked out how the shadow would necessarily be, depending on the light. But you can see there that what I'm putting on is simple glaze, just similar to what I did in the orange itself. But this time it's a cooler bluish color, tiny wee bit of red in it. But you can see that I'm allowing the under color to shine through it. Okay, so that's one element that is important. We'll let that dry, come back and talk about another element of shadows. So another element of shadows is the fact that if you have light striking from here, let's say, from the sun or whatever, that light will strike that side. That will cause the other side to be in shadow because it's not getting at the light. However, the light also passes the object and hits the floor and hits the walls and hits all the other objects around it. And there'll be a certain amount of bounce back onto this side. That's why this side isn't pure black, because we can see it because there's sunlight. And we sometimes think of shadow as having no light at all, but it's all relative. Now, if the light comes back and hits that side of the orange, it's going to probably bounce off again and in down here into this area where the shadow is. So we often then will get, and you can see I've just made an orange. This is a pure orange that I was using earlier on. It's very, very thin, very transparent. You can see it there on that little bit of palette, I hope. And I can then take a little hint of that orange in through the shadow. It may not have to be all of the shadow, but you can see there, I'm actually wiping a little bit away because I think it may not even have needed that much. And it's pure orange, but it's mixing obviously with the previous color, and that color mixed with that color because it's all layered. We're not mixing up thick, but you can see the little glow that we get within the shadow, which is common because we don't, shadows in themselves aren't just necessarily one color. They're not just like gray. The colors of a shadow depend on what's striking into that area. So you can see how I've put a little bit of that. Sometimes it's stronger. It all depends on the light source. But therefore, it gives us that sense that there's a color being bounced and reflected off this tabletop or whatever this is. So glazing as a method can be used in anything, not only the object, but the shadows and the light and everything else. Now, the last thing I want to point out now is that with acrylics and oils, which are slightly different to watercolors, obviously, that there's an element of ability to use white because, we have white to use. Watercolor painters generally would maybe not use white. So what I'm doing here, I'm going to hopefully squeeze, find a wee bit of white. It's one of these things where it takes 3 days for the paint to come out the other end. There we are. So if we look at the white, and this is where it gets really, really delicate. And we've got to be very careful with white, because it is chalky, it is opaque, and it can make things look very pastely. But this is all medium here on my palette. You can just about see, hopefully, there's quite a lot of it. So I'm going to show you, I don't know if you can see that corner, that's the white. Okay, that is the amount of white that I'm putting into that medium, which really is very, very little. I'm going to give that brush a wipe with a wee trace of orange still on it. So you can see maybe on my hand, you see there's the white. It's so transparent, it's just about visible. And again, I'm going to try something. I'm going to put it up here as what is known as scumbling. Scumbling is a term that's often used when white is brought into a glaze. And it's so thin and so transparent, but hopefully you can see the difference. You can see the white appearing on it. And out around this light area where we're assuming the light's coming, I hope you can see that bit of white, and the light's catching it slightly. That's maybe a wee bit better there. You can see the subtlety of that light. Now, if we overdid it, it'll start to look horrible, pastely shade, and it's slightly unnatural. But you can see how that creates a lovely sense of light catching an object. And we haven't had to mix that light orange color. That orange color was that color plus white, but applied very, very thinly. So we can very, very, very carefully use white as part of it, And it's very quite satisfying sort of thing to do, because you can see, you can maybe hear the brush marks, but you can see how I'm getting this lovely, delicate, soft light on the edge of that object. So hopefully that's of use to you. Now what I want you to do, sorry, that was just my door slamming with the wind. What I want you to do now is try some of these little exercises. Let me see the results and send them to me by email.